It's 1966, and you live in this tiny town in West Virginia that sits on the banks of the Ohio River called Point Pleasant. Nothing much ever happens here until one day, some kids driving around back roads late at night bump into a red-eyed, flying gargoyle. They race back to town where they report this thing to the police, who in turn make it into a media frenzy, and before you know it, people from all over the area are talking about their own encounters with the Mothman.
Now it's 2017. The world is a very different place than it was 50 plus years ago, and yet the pattern begins to repeat. Again, sightings of a strange humanoid creature with wings and red eyes reemerge. The media turns it into a circus. Paranormal investigators come out of the woodwork to stake a claim to the case, and suddenly, everything that happened in the 1960s is happening anew. Only this time, it's not sleepy rural West Virginia at the center of the maelstrom. It's Chicago.
Now it's a few years since the Chicago wave of sightings began. Infighting within the various organizations investigating the case has broken out. The media has moved on to other stories, but some are still trying to get at the truth of what happened.
Including us.
I'm Seth Breedlove, a documentary filmmaker and founder of Small Town Monsters.
And I'm Heather Moser, researcher and producer at STM. As we dive into this case, we thought what better place to begin an investigation into the famed Lake Michigan Mothman than where the creature was first seen.
We actually met for the first time in Point Pleasant.
Yeah, we did. I heard about your movie through the cryptid investigative kind of circles online.
So you're a folklorist.
Correct.
PhD, working on it.
Working on PhD, finishing up my dissertation right now.
So this is your specialty.
This is my specialties.
So 2017 is also the year where our movie came out. So all of a sudden, right before our film comes out, there's this rash of sightings that sparks up around Chicago.
Yeah.
What do you remember about all that?
So I, at the time, was really starting to gear up my own research. I began my PhD program in 2016. So by the summer of 2017, I had done field work, I had done research, I had done other types of readings about this material before. In spring of 2017, you see a rash of sightings really start to crop up around April, early May area that are reported initially to both MUFON, or the Mutual UFO Network, and to UFO Clearinghouse. Those reports were then later investigated, and they were reported kind of more publicly on other websites. They were picked up by Facebook, by other social media things, especially Twitter.
What were people seeing?
Well, the reports are a little bit different. They're not super consistent. What we most commonly see is a large winged creature, much more bird-like in nature, with feathers on it typically, very dark in color, oftentimes reported as black, with glowing red eyes or glowing yellow eyes, very traditionally. Some people also described very expansive wings, sometimes broaching 10 to 12 feet in size. So often the terrestrial explanation that would be attached to this would be an owl and a sandhill crane, much like the original Point Pleasant sightings, because both Point Pleasant and the Chicagoland area have a significant number of sandhill cranes. So you see that being attached there oftentimes. By July of 2017, you see popular media sites begin to pick it up, like NPR, Medium, Vox, the Chicago Tribune, Vice as well.
Okay.
It's starting to be reported everywhere. And that's when we see that break from the cryptozoological community talking about it, and you see the public at large talking about it. And the Chicago Mothman becomes a social figure in the scene of Chicago. People start talking about other sightings they've had, and also talking about UFO sightings that they're having in conjunction with seeing the creature.
What do you remember about 2017, like the Mothman stuff? Because you weren't intricately involved with STM at that point.
No, I just remember hearing that the sightings had started early on, like in April. Mothman at Point Pleasant's movie was getting ready to come out, and it was an anniversary year.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and so the rumors, which I thought were highly amusing, were that STM had somehow started these sightings in Chicago.
April 17th, 2017. It was about 6 in the morning. It was dawn just breaking where you could see things, but still dark enough. And I took my garbage out, laid it at the street, and looked up and saw this thing. I think it would have been maybe 7, 8 feet tall, but it was hunched over and it looked like it was black. I didn't see eyes, but it looked very dark, but I could tell, like from the light coming up, like a leathery look. And I looked at it, and I froze for a moment, and the thing started going, ooh, and I didn't see this appear. It was just kind of there, like as I was walking to take the garbage out, I didn't see that. So it was just kind of there, again, in the same spot. And it was going, these really creepy noises, and it was loud. And I remember freezing, and then I was trying to get my keys, and I was looking at it, and it seemed to be coming at me like you would see in a strobe light. And I just remember thinking, because we had problems getting in the front door with the key, I'm like, please let this key go in. And I'm looking at this thing, and it got about halfway between where it was and me. I got the key in the door, shut the door. I called my neighbor upstairs right away, look outside, look outside. He didn't see anything. And so, that was it. So it was very scary every morning, that really stuck with me. At that time of day, taking the garbage out or anything, I'd always wondered. But
can you real quick talk about the location where that happened? What's the land like around there?
Well, it's I'm a mile into town, but there's wetlands around me, the forest preserve, Lakewood Forest Preserve, huge, and that's on 2 sides of where I live.
Know where you are now? Anything strange happening there? I mean, like sightings, not necessarily anything for you, but have you heard of other sightings where you are now?
Yeah, the 5 that happened right at Dewfield Pond, that's about 3/4 of a mile away from me. That, and then at Jewel right across from that. And I've gone there and sat there to try to imagine. I know right where that happened. So within a few miles, there were 5 different things that happened shortly after I moved there.
So Heather, we're in Illinois, which is not, I think, the location you think of when you think of the Mothman. And obviously we've both been familiar with this case since at least 2017. Yeah. It is one of the more controversial cases we've looked into.
It seems to be.
Yeah, but I think overall, what do you want to achieve? Like, what do you think the ultimate goal of being here in the first place is?
I think that it's going to be interesting to see how investigators are collecting data when it comes to Mothman here in this area. And I think it'll also be interesting to see some differences in the reports that they receive, and just out of my own curiosity, how closely this resembles what we're familiar with down in West Virginia.
I think that tends to be the biggest red flag with this case, is how many anonymous reports there are. But being here and seeing how sprawling the area is and how populated it is, I think it's going to be a very different kind of location for small town monsters to be in a place that's just overrun with people.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think we got a little taste of that on the way here with just traffic and things you don't have to worry about in some of these other places where we look for cryptids typically. Do
you have any, I hate to put you on the spot, but do you have any preconceived notions or theories or thoughts on the Chicago Mothman flap?
Well, I don't like to dismiss things, so I would say that people are seeing something. Maybe not all the reports that are coming in that are raising red flags or whatnot are maybe real as far as that goes, but people are seeing something. Someone is seeing something, maybe not everybody. but someone is, and I think it'll be interesting to talk to these people and try to figure out what that is.
Cool. Tomorrow morning we're going to get started.
Eyewitness sightings of the Mothman around Chicago were initially reported to the Mutual UFO Network, presumably because of their reputation for investigating airborne anomalies. Eventually, additional accounts began to come into two other sources: Lon Strickler's Phantoms and Monsters website and UFO Clearinghouse, run by Manuel Navarrete. Lon eventually started his own investigative team, which handled the Chicago sightings.
Around this time, a paranormal website called the Singular Fortean Society, which was headed up by husband and wife team of Tobias and Emily Whalen, began to find sighting reports filling their inbox as well. Tobias got in touch with Strickler, and soon he and Emily were both involved in the Chicago Mothman Task Force. Tobias and Emily had a leg up on most of the other investigators involved in the case since they were local and were able to both actively visit sighting locations as well as talk directly to witnesses.
So one thing that's interesting is that we're not actually in Chicago, despite everybody talking about Chicago Mothman, but we're in the suburbs, and we're in Schaumburg, right?
Yes.
One of the questions that I had for you are like the preponderance of sightings that aren't actually in downtown Chicago. Like, is there a pattern in suburbs sprawling out from there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my argument really has always been that the most interesting sightings aren't the downtown Chicago sightings. The vast majority of the sightings that we get that we were able to investigate well, that is to say actually speak to real human beings, go on site and stuff like that, usually occur in smaller areas. And so that's going to mean suburbs. And it's certainly not limited to Chicago either. I think some of the best sightings that we've had are in smaller towns. Not just in Illinois, but yeah, definitely spreading out from there, but also in Wisconsin. There have been some great sightings in like Indiana and in smaller, more rural areas.
The Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON for short, has branches in nearly every state. And each branch has a head who oversees the day-to-day operations within each region. In Illinois, the head of MUFON is Sam Moranto. Sam has been involved in the Chicago sightings since the initial reports were fielded back in 2011. He's also been involved in other well-publicized events, such as the O'Hare UFO sightings of the early aughts.
In stark contrast to Sam's placement within the highly regarded Mutual UFO Network, Jack Chavez is something of a rogue. He doesn't involve himself in organizations and prefers to investigate the paranormal independently. However, the two first met during the 2017 sightings and have since been joined at the hip when it comes to the Chicago encounters. If Tobias and Emily are the Chicago Mothman's yin, then Sam and Jack make up its yang.
Yeah, so I first heard about the sightings in April of 2017. I believe not the first, but one of the first 2017 sightings was in the Pilsen neighborhood, which is where I was living. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of these sightings.
I'm curious how the story around here first broke. Like, what was it like when the first reports came in, around the time period that happened, and what some of the first sightings were?
Sure. So the first sightings that we saw were the ones that came through the Mutual UFO Network, and MUFON had published a short article on them, and it was three fairly basic sightings of people, talking about seeing this large flying creature.
In fact, that very first sighting in 2017, first report, came into MUFON. We received, I believe, the second, third, and fourth report, though it's been touted that we received the first three, and that isn't the case.
When it first came in, I didn't think anything of it. Pretty early on, I think we figured out that some of them were birds, pretty early. I just remember you sitting at your laptop like every other day being like, another one came in. And I'm like, what? Another one of those flying humanoids.
I was reading the reports, and one of the reports at the bottom said, investigators will, updates as time goes on. And often in paranormal reports, you do hear that kind of statement, but then you never hear about a follow-up. So I said, this is happening right by me. I want to know who's investigating this. I want to know, where they're at, etc. Because I was already, investigating various other aspects of the paranormal.
And I came to find out later after talking to Sam Moranto, the state director for MUFON for Illinois, that they weren't really able to follow up on him. He had limited email correspondence and that was about it. But at the time, I saw him and I was writing news articles for the Singular Fortean Society. And so I thought, well, this would be an interesting article. I think that I can add a little bit of context, maybe compare it to the other flying humanoid sightings that we've had in the US. And I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. I thought it was going to be one weird article and that would be it. And we would move on with our lives and I'd never hear about it again.
I'm going to take them back to 2011, if that's all right. 2011, we had 3 reports come in, and unfortunately that information has been published incorrectly. The very first report, which was 63rd and Pulaski, wasn't a sighting at all. A gentleman and his wife were out taking pictures of a large Native American statue on 63rd and Pulaski. And the reason for that was the unusual image that you would get a glimpse of. If you look at it the right way, his thumb looks like something other than his thumb, but another appendage sticking out of his pants. And he wanted to take a picture of it. So he took that picture, and of course he took a look at the photos, and in that photo he sees this unusual image there. And that image was in the air, therefore it was an unidentified flying object. More research has been done on that photo than anything you could have imagined. And to this day, we know what it is. And we've dealt with a lot of professionals in photography, and think what you will, that's a kite. Now, in June, I think it was June 22nd, 2017, I was speaking at the Fortean Conference in Maryland and met a wildlife photographer and a paranormal photographer. And they looked at the image. It wasn't anything paranormal. And the gentleman said that it is definitely not something alive. I showed him some of the reports from 2011 and also those that came in 2017. And they said most of these reports seem to be creative writing as far as that goes, and nothing more than that.
But that's obviously not what happened. It wasn't very long after that I started seeing sightings come in and be reported through Phantoms and Monsters, so Lon Strickler over there, and then UFO Clearinghouse. And at the time, I had no idea who those guys were. I wasn't very savvy when it came to internet paranormal stuff. I wasn't really active on forums or interested in looking at paranormal stuff on the internet for the most part. And so I had to take it upon myself to find out who these people were and talk to them. And I did. I interviewed them both separately in June and July of 2017. I found them to be fairly forthright in terms of talking about their investigation so far. What really stuck out to me at that time was that nobody was really pushing any pet theories. There are a lot of people in the paranormal that they have these pet theories, and so anytime something crosses their desk, they try to fit it into their particular box. And I didn't see a lot of that happening at that time. And from there, the sightings just kept coming in, and as I reported on them, then we started to receive our own sightings. It turned out that we sort of traveled in the same circles, Lon and I anyway, and so he asked if we would like to just sort of work together to investigate this, and since we were getting our own sighting reports anyway, that just sort of made sense, and here we are.
Lon Strickler's Phantoms and Monsters made a name for itself by publishing reports from sighting witnesses and recounting terrifying interactions with the unknown. In 2011, Strickler relayed a trio of encounters with a being he dubbed the Chicago Phantom, a humanoid winged creature that was witnessed on 3 occasions before disappearing quietly into the night, until 2017. In February of 2017, Phantoms and Monsters published this account, which was credited as being the first such sighting of that year.
My husband John, who's a huge skeptic, as we all know, and doesn't believe in stuff like this, was just driving home in the dark, and he saw what he thought was a person running on 2 legs across the highway, and then it turned into a giant black bird and flew up away. He swears it was running on 2 legs. Then was the biggest bird he ever saw flying with long legs?
The account proved to be a tipping point for the media coverage of sightings of the Phantom. As more reports began to funnel through phantoms and monsters, Strickler found himself at the center of a sudden deluge of media interest in the case. It's important to understand Strickler's role here and to get his own personal remembrances of the earliest days of what has become known as the Chicago Mothman.
Hang it in there.
What was the first case that came to you, and what was your initial reaction?
Well, initially, the cases started back in 2011. There were 3 cases that were reported to the MUFON CMS. We never had any information from the actual witnesses themselves. All we had was what was reported to MUFON. It was, it was interesting. I didn't know what it really was, what it really meant. But as time went on, these cases started coming through other means. And in fact, after the initial MUFON cases were reported and I was posting them on the blog, people were noticing, and then we started getting phone calls from witnesses. And the one thing that we did notice and was quite surprised at was that these witnesses were very emphatic about the actual sighting themselves, and they wouldn't embellish on it, which, is very unusual. We even tried to prod them a bit to get them to try to change their story to see where they'd go with it, but no, they stuck with it. It was almost like they were imprinted.
The beginning of 2017 saw an onslaught of reports of a winged humanoid beginning in February and stretching into October, marking the most active year of these sightings to date. The sightings throughout the year ran the gamut. A witness seeing a person turn into a large black bird off the side of Interstate 294. Months later, a family returning home from Mass encounters what they describe as a red-eyed, winged goblin which emanated a foreboding sense of evil. Reports denoted key physical characteristics, ranging from a humanoid with bat-like wings to a human-sized creature with an owl-like appearance. Red eyes were also observed by several witnesses. Man-sized, winged beings seemed to be pervading the Chicagoland area. Witnesses were labeling the Chicago Mothman as many different things while relating their experiences to investigators. Sometimes it was similar to a bird, while other times it was more gargoyle in appearance. Other times it was even more sinister, being categorized as a demon or a devil.
As Tobias and Emily found themselves pulled deeper into the Chicago Mothman case, their connection to the creature sightings became more public. Soon reports were pouring into the Singular Fortean Society website, the bulk of them detailing reports outside of the Chicago area, and even into other states like Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Suddenly, the Chicago Mothman name didn't quite ring true. Tobias began referring to the creature being seen as the Lake Michigan Mothman, due to the preponderance of reports taking place in areas that bordered or were simply close to the Great Lake. Many of these reports weren't coming in from cities, but rural areas. Even the bulk of sightings in the greater Chicago area tended to be not only nearer to the suburbs than the city itself, but also in or around wetlands or metro parks.
A couple years ago, 2016-ish, August time before school started at night. My mom's a nurse. She works nights, so 10:30 is when she leaves the house. And I always walk her out to her car. So I walk her out, she pulls off, and I'm just walking up the walkway back to our house. And I hear, just out of nowhere, a very loud, very weird sound. Sounded like a velociraptor from Jurassic Park. Like screeching, but very bird-like, So I immediately whip my head to where the source is coming from, which is in this big tree in our yard. And I instantly see, just in the middle of the blackness, I just see 2 very large red eyes, very widely spaced. And then as soon as I made eye contact with it, it made the sound again. I instantly ran to the door, go inside, and start prevailing, what was that? Oh my gosh. I'm a big nature person. I'm very fascinated by birds of prey, owls specifically. So I'm very just conscious of what birds are like, because they instantly were trying to say that's what it was, something like that, And I was like, I don't know. I'm not saying I know what it was. I'm just saying I know what it was not, and it was not the following.
Now, the first sighting reports came through in the spring of 2017, and this is around the time that this guy had had his sighting as well. So that was in Mukwonago, Wisconsin, and so this guy had had his sighting. He was headed home pretty late one night, and he was driving home in his van, and he's talking to his friend on his cell phone while he's driving home. And for anybody not familiar with Mukwonago, it's a fairly rural, small town. And so it's very dark out there, and the only light that he had as he pulled into his driveway is one lamppost at the very end of their gravel driveway. And so he pulls into their driveway, and at the time he lived with his parents, he decided, I'm going to stay outside and I'll just finish my conversation rather than risk waking my parents up. And so he's talking on his phone with his friend, and at a certain point he said that he realized that there was the silhouette of this figure sort of outlined in the ambient light from the lamppost is about 50 feet away. So he starts telling his friend what's happening and decides that he wants to get a better look at it, so he turns his headlights on, and he says, in the light of his headlights, is what he described as a humanoid bat dragon. And the reason he described it that way, and you'll see this a lot actually, people struggle with the vocabulary to describe these kinds of sightings because they're so far outside of their experience. And so he landed on humanoid bat dragon, which is as good as anything. He said as he was staring at it in the light of his headlights, this thing sort of blurred and then it was gone. And he didn't know if that meant that it just took up into the air very quickly, or if it literally just disappeared or teleported, or God only knows, right? But that was his sighting. That was his story, and he told it to me first over the phone, and then it was agreed that Emily and I would go and check it out, and he would show us the sighting area and where everything happened, and all of the parts of his story that we could measure and confirm, it all added up. Everything as far as the weather and everything else in his story, we were able to corroborate.
Does the nature of these sightings, is there a specific mood or nature to the sightings that kind of stands out? Is it just strange that people are seeing a winged humanoid? Is it terrifying? What, if there's one thing you could kind of point to?
They definitely are always scared, but what always gets me is that it's happening in the most mundane of circumstances. He probably did this a lot. He probably came outside to talk to his friends a lot on the phone. We had the sighting in Woodstock, Illinois. Some guy was just gonna drive to get milk quick at the Walgreens down the road. It's everyday people going about their business, and then all of a sudden this really bizarre thing happens, and I think it's just beyond a lot of their comprehension.
This is the Dewfield Pond Conservation Area in Woodstock, Illinois. This is actually just outside the entrance, is where in February of 2018 there was a man who was returning home from the local Walgreens, less than a mile really from where he lived, and as he was driving along the road, he saw what he at first thought, I guess, was a tall, hairy humanoid, until he noticed the leathery wings coming out of its back. So really, all he was able to see was what was caught in his headlights, which, was several seconds of him seeing this thing, which he said walked out in front of him and walked across the road before he lost sight of it.
Now, were there other sightings that happened in this area aside from that one?
There were a few. We had one where a gentleman emailed us, and he said that he was in the parking lot of the Jewel Ostco, and he was, I guess he was out in the parking lot, and he was sort of looking towards the fairgrounds, and there's a big fence between the parking lot and the fairgrounds. And he said that he saw basically what this other guy described, so this 8-foot tall, hairy humanoid with leathery wings. And he said that it had charged the fence, and at that point he was scared enough that he called 911. And I was like, well, that's a pretty impressive story. Can I talk to you? Could you get me a copy of a police report? And he's like, yeah, sure, of course. And then I never heard from him again. And so I was ready to write that one off. If a witness ghosts me with that little of information, I usually don't pursue it. But I thought, well, he said he called 911. And I filed a FOIA request with the McHenry County Sheriff's Department because that's who covers this area. And sure enough, they didn't have an official police report because no crime had been committed or anything. But they had an incident detail report that did show that this gentleman did call 911 and a sheriff's deputy did respond, and he didn't find a monster or anything, but he took this guy's statement and it was consistent with what he had told me. So if nothing else, we know whatever happened, and for whatever reason, this guy really did call 911.
And you could tell that after talking to us and showing it was just like a big weight had been lifted off their chest, even though you'd talked on the phone.
Yeah.
It was just kind of like after everything was said and done, like, whew, okay, now I can move on with my life kind of thing.
Yeah, there's like a cathartic release, really.
So I was working my day job at the time, and I was working right on the south side of Chicago by a rock quarry, and the expressway 8094 drives over the rock quarry. It's very important for the story. I was getting off of work that night, and I was in a really bad headspace, real bad emotional situation, right? I was getting off work that night, and I decided I was done, and I'll just leave it at that. You know, I was going home, obviously, right? I'll spare the details. As I got on the expressway right by the rock quarry, my radio turned to static. And it was kind of strange because my radio has never done that before. And I was like, go figure, right? I'm having a bad enough day and I can't even listen to generic FM radio on my way home just to be done with it. And I look up as the radio's kind of going through static. And off to my right, on the right-hand side, kind of above the rock quarry, was this, what I thought was a bat at the time, real big. I pull over to the side of the road because the thing looked like it was glowing, I guess is the best way to describe it. And there were 3 other motorists that pulled off to the side of the road with me. I get out of my car, looking up at the thing. It was just kind of hovering there. And I kind of noticed it had like this grayish silver tone to it. Big wingspan. This wasn't anything I've ever seen. I turned to the other motorists because we were all getting ready to pull out our phones, and at that point the thing kind of just flew off. And then I turned to them, I say, any of you guys get pictures? Any of you see that? And they're like, no. And got the shakes here. It's always weird telling this story. And I told them, I'm like, well, I guess that was something, right? And they're like, oh yeah. And the one motorist turned to me and said, hey, I hope you have a really good night. And I don't know why, I guess just being in that kind of mental space where you're just done, you don't expect to hear something like that. I got back in my car, and as I was driving, the static was still there, but it was less prominent, and I could hear songs coming over the radio. And there were 3 songs that came on. One was Staying Alive by the Bee Gees. One was a 21 Pilots. Yeah, 21 Pilots, they had a song about like carrying on something. And then the third one, because I was just getting irritated, I'm like, listen, I don't want to listen to music about survival at this moment because I'm already beat up and tore down. I told you my mental space was bad. And the last one that came on was Sweet Dreams by Annie Lennox. And then my radio cut off as I was going down, getting closer to the Indiana border. Back on, no problem. I got home that night and I called the paranormal investigator friend because I couldn't explain what I went through, whether it be angelic or sign from something. But I knew when I got home, I sat in my car for a while trying to put pieces together, and that's when I called my friend. I was like, this is what I'm experiencing, right? This is what I've been what I just went through. Can you tell me what I just experienced? No, this is his answer. He's just like, that's really odd. He's like, you saw something physical, concrete. It wasn't, a specter, spirit, ghost, whatever. I was like, no, that thing was concrete, physical. Like I could see it. That day, I heard stories and rumblings all throughout Chicagoland that other people were seeing the same exact thing. I don't know. It's weird because I got out there and it's just me, them, and it. And I'm reaching for my phone to get a picture and it's gone. I don't know. That's about it. So I don't remember hearing anything or seeing it, like, yeah, I've heard of the other stories, like from the Mothman cases in Point Pleasant, you hear of the weird noises or the voice in your head, or it's trying to cause you harm, or you watch these documentaries about Mothman living in someone's bathroom, drawing on their walls with a crayon. Yes, that's a thing. And I didn't have any of that. Mine was a pure, like, hey, this is who you are. This is what you're doing currently. And why don't you feel better, I guess.
The Lake Michigan reports were continually being tied back to the 1960s sightings from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. In June of 2017, Small Town Monsters unveiled a film I directed detailing the 1960s events titled The Mothman of Point Pleasant. That documentary, along with the 15-year anniversary of the release of the 2002 Richard Gere film The Mothman Prophecies, both overlapped with the 50th anniversary of the Silver Bridge collapse. The Mothman was very much in the public consciousness.
Due to this fact, some, including key members of MUFON, cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman, and others had begun to speculate that STM was behind the Chicago Mothman sightings as part of a viral marketing scheme to promote our documentary. There was nothing to these mumblings. Nonetheless, the Chicago happenings and those in the past were continually linked, leading to the inevitable question one must ask if investigating the Lake Michigan encounters. How do these sightings connect to the most infamous wave of flying humanoid sightings in history?
Are there parameters? Do you subscribe to the fact that there are parameters to the Mothman of Point Pleasant flap that are unique to that particular case?
That's a very complex question, and why it's so difficult to answer is that if you look at the legend migration process for how that occurs, it's often due to what we call a genre shift. So the move from one genre to another allows that migration process to happen because it's no longer tethered so closely to the place. So when you look at the incidences of Mothman in Point Pleasant, what you see is that central to each of those legendary narratives that you hear is the town of Point Pleasant, the TNT area, being out in the woods, being somewhere that's wholly Appalachian. But when you look at the migrated versions of Mothman, both in Chicago, in Japan, in Chernobyl, in Mexico, you don't see that tie to Point Pleasant other than in the name of the creature. So a genre shift has occurred from where it is no longer the same type of narrative that you saw in Point Pleasant. It's a completely different narrative now.
What I have found to be really interesting, and coming more from a social sciences background in psychology, has been a number of the reports that have come forth on the Chicago end of things seem to mirror certain aspects of what happened in Point Pleasant. And so we found a lot of terminology that seems to exist in both areas, such as silhouetted, moonlit sky, things of that nature. There are a lot of language correlates.
One of the things that's really stood out to me since I first started researching Mothman and looking at the corpus around the Mothman phenomena is the importance of language and how language has really dictated how people tell these stories. What I mean when I say that is the original Mothman sightings that occurred in Point Pleasant weren't called Mothman, it was called the bird. And there's very much still a strong contingent in Point Pleasant that refers to it as the bird. And I think what's so fascinating is you see kind of a later ascription to sightings that are more akin to this bird idea, where people later say, oh, it's the Mothman, because it has these similar physical characteristics, so it gets lumped into this category of Mothman. When we're trying to categorize these unexplainable phenomena, again, we look for this pattern, we look for patterns. And physical form becomes one of the easiest patterns for something unexplainable because you can't talk about its motives, you can't talk about where it's from, you don't know. So you have to describe it by its form. So one of the things that's happening with the Chicago flap versus the Point Pleasant flap in the 1960s is that there are some forms that are missing from the experiencers in Chicago's narratives. For example, there has not been a disaster yet, and that is one of the primary things that has allowed this genre shift away from Point Pleasant, is this inclusion of the Mothman as omen.
I think the thing that I found the most interesting in terms of the entire Mothman genre, going back decades and decades and decades and maybe centuries, is the idea that Mothman could be a Garuda or a Thunderbird in the Western American, Native American tradition. To me, it seemed to me that it's been an ultimate crime-fighting type of a deity that shows up not to cause harm, but to warn of impending doom. So going back to the Silver Bridge collapse and that area there, when Mothman made itself the most known back then, obviously we have the collapse of the Silver Bridge and the other various things that happened in Point Pleasant. Along with that, what I can say, that to take that and extrapolate that to the Chicagoland area and the Northern Illinois area, the aspects of high strangeness that were very well documented that existed in Point Pleasant, I've not seen those documented here in the Chicagoland area at all. So to call this aspect of what's taking place here right now high strangeness, I think is a stretch of the term. I think it's a term that's utilized a little bit too loosely these days, although I do think that there is some kind of an undercurrent. I don't know if it's a Mothman or a Garuda or anything of that nature, but there does seem to be something a little strange happening here.
So one thing stands out to me, and that is the fact that you've got 3 different timelines as opposed to 2, which is what I think most people consider the Chicago phenomenon. One is 2011, which we learned about from Sam. I was not aware of any sightings in 2011. The other is 2017. And then there's this other timeline that starts around 2017 and runs concurrent with what we call the Chicago Mothman. And that seems to be these sightings out in the suburbs that really are coming in from Tobias.
Right.
So to me, there's 3 different timelines playing out.
Right.
The Chicago stuff, so far to me, seems a little suspect. One thing that I kept thinking of yesterday is this idea that the Mothman is a harbinger, which obviously originated with John Keel. People are looking to make that connection with the Chicago stuff.
Nothing's happening.
Yeah, but nothing's happening. I think what people also ignore is the fact that the Silver Bridge collapse didn't signal the end of Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It continued forever, apparently. It's still going on.
Well, I kind of got that out of my head whenever we were doing research for Mothman Legacy in general, because it's something in the original Mothman story, it has continued, like you said. So in the Silver Bridge, I think that's just I'm not buying that he was there to signal that. So maybe it could be like a warning, I guess, but I don't know what for, like I don't know what we're waiting on.
One of the arguments put forth by skeptics during the Point Pleasant Mothman flap in the 60s was the lack of photographic and video evidence of the creature. The creature seemingly failed to leave behind much physical evidence during that time as well. A lot has changed in the last 50 years, though. The majority of people have access to a high-definition camera that they carry in their pockets, ready to snap photos at any time.
This leads us to one of the most common questions regarding the Chicago Mothman sightings. Why isn't there a preponderance of media evidence of this creature? Between cell phones, traffic cameras, and security cameras in such highly populated areas, skeptics hold that we should be inundated with evidence of this being's existence.
There's a guy bicycling to work, and this is in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. And as he's biking to work, he sees this man and woman. They're standing on the street corner, and the man is pointing at something in the sky. And so he looks up and he sees what he later described to me over the phone as either a giant bat or a man in a wingsuit. And I will say this, there is nothing about his testimony that I took as anything less than 100% his authentic experience in that moment. So he sees these people pointing at something, he looks up, he sees what he thought was either a giant bat or a man in a wingsuit. And he's got a GoPro camera on his helmet, luckily, and so he decides he's gonna follow this thing around and he's gonna get as much footage as he can before he has to get to work. And God bless him, he does. And even better, after I talked to him, he was like, hey, would you like the footage? And he was kind enough, he actually mailed us the SD card. And it's very far away. And it's hard to tell what it is, but there were a few frames that were able to be blown up. And when you look at them, it's a bird. It's absolutely a bird. It likely, from its silhouette, is a great blue heron because it has that silhouette with like sort of the legs up behind it and its head tucked back and like the large sort of curved wings. From that, that was really the moment in 2018 where I was like, some of these are definitely birds, because this guy was dead serious about what he saw, and he thought he saw this giant bat or person in a wingsuit. Personally, like my opinion, I think it accounts for about 40% of these sightings. It's not the exciting answer. It's not the answer people want to hear, but it's also not the entire story, you know? So you think if that accounts for 40%, well, then what the hell is the other 60%, right? And that's where it gets really interesting. But if we're not doing our due diligence and explaining the ones we can in terms of explanations that are available, you know, and rational and provable, frankly, then why would anybody believe us about any of the really weird stuff?
As 2017 wore on, other investigators began to become involved in the ongoing Lake Michigan Mothman events. A Chicago-based paranormal researcher named Allison Jornlin was one of the first to visit the bulk of the witness sighting locations. Jornlin initially was involved in Lon Strickler's Chicago Mothman task force, but eventually left the group due to her skepticism regarding the validity of the case.
Strickler, Jornlin, and the Whalens had a fairly public falling out that led to a number of the investigators involved choosing sides. In one camp, Sam and Jack aligned with Jornlin, while on the opposite side of the fence sat Strickler and the Whalens. Regardless of this division, the number of sightings being reported remained steady, while the celebrity of the Lake Michigan Mothman continued to grow. However, behind the scenes and within the paranormal community at large, the creature was beginning to find itself overshadowed by the investigators' own interpersonal drama.
Do you notice any differences between the way the Chicago stuff was approached by the investigators versus the original flap, the 66, 67 stuff?
So when we think about how the investigations in 1967 were completed, there's one name we associate primarily with those investigations, John Keel, for obvious reasons. He wrote the book. He was really involved with the investigations occurring here in Point Pleasant, in conjunction with Mary Heyer, who was doing a lot of reporting for the Athens, Ohio Messenger, while living in Point Pleasant on the same block as the Silver Bridge, essentially. So she really was integral to his connections with the community. She was an on-the-ground person who was familiar with most people who lived in Point Pleasant and helped facilitate for Keel introductions, reports that she wrote to him using letters and snail mail about what was happening in Point Pleasant when he wasn't researching here. In Chicago, you see a similarity in that a lot of people who were initially investigating in the Chicago area sightings didn't live in Chicago. So for example, Lon Strickler, who has been one of the most prolific investigators of the Chicagoland phenomena, has not been to Chicago during the flap beginning in 2017. A lot of what he was investigating was utilizing phone calls, as well as some people who were on the ground. Additionally, with the way information moves in today's landscapes, reports are often distributed the day or the day after they happen. So a report can happen, be submitted to the UFO Clearinghouse, for example, or Phantoms and Monsters, and then it immediately will hit that social media sphere where it begins to be more widely distributed. Because it's so easily accessible too, you see much more concern from witnesses about sharing personal details. Like, a lot of witnesses don't feel comfortable sharing their names publicly. All of that makes investigating today much more complicated than the 1966 and 1967 sightings, where Mary Heyer was interacting with people who she knew, who she had a rapport with already. Manuel and everyone else who has investigated this, like the Whalens, they have to build that rapport with the witnesses rather than having it already ingrained as part of the community itself.
What about infighting? Because there's a lot of that with the Chicago stuff. Was there that same kind of back and forth between investigators in the 60s?
In terms of infighting, we see that the relationship between Barker and Keel was a little bit more strained, but unlike the Chicago Mothman or Chicagoland creature sightings, there weren't as many people invested in Point Pleasant from the investigative standpoint. But what happened in Chicago was that there were vastly more investigators on the ground. There was a task force created very quickly after the 2017 sightings began. And the unfortunate reality is when you get people who are incredibly invested in the outcome, especially the truthiness of a certain creature's existence, you find people who become very quickly dissatisfied with the level of research that's being completed. And ultimately, going back to the earlier point about witnesses, that can become a point of strong contention. How can you verify that a witness is even real if you don't know who they are, if you don't have their name? And if they're not willing to say their name, how do we know they're telling the truth? How do we verify that what they say they saw actually happened? And especially because when everyone has an iPhone and there's no photos being taken of the creature, people start to become skeptical really, really fast.
Well, the thing was, of all the photographs that we've had, all of them can be explained, that we've seen, all can be explained. And that's nothing wrong with that. You're trying to find out what it is or it is not. Let's get down to something weird. We know weird exists. This is Illinois. Oh, we got all sorts of weird stuff.
If there really is something strange going on, if there is something paranormal about those sightings, first of all, what makes you think it's capable of being photographed? And beyond that, when you speak to witnesses, generally these sightings happen very, very quickly. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't even get my phone out in time to take a picture of our dog when he's doing something cute, let alone a red-eyed flying humanoid that I see for 3 to 5 seconds while I am scared out of my mind.
Okay, guys, last night we were in Chicago. We're staying at the Congress Plaza Hotel. I was going outside to shoot some location B-roll of the L train. This sounds ridiculous, but I promise this is exactly what happened. I walked out of the hotel. I hit the sidewalk, and almost immediately, there's a small crowd of people out there. Almost immediately, coming down the road behind me, I hear flapping, but very loud and fast. So I turn, I see a flash of movement go fairly low to the ground, but picking up altitude as it went over my head, and I hit record on my camera, and I managed to get it as it went past, so I wanted to show you guys.
So, without seeing the video, can you describe to me what it looked like to you?
Yes, and I want to preface this by saying I am aware that it is more than likely a known bird of some sort.
Okay.
But as it went overhead, I think I said to someone it looked like a human, it was like human size, is what I thought
it was
as it
massive.
went overhead.
Yeah.
Alright, so this is full speed. No, I'm not even gonna say. It goes behind a lens flare, which is like a great moment in cinema. J.J. Abrams, and that's it. So there's that's 8 seconds. I brightened it, I stabilized it, and it's shot at 120, so it's like a really slow shot. Right there. Like, it's almost like there's a hinge in the middle of that thing.
I mean, if you look at the air conditioners on this building on the left, it does look to be about like a little bit larger in scale.
It's beyond the building.
How far beyond
It's
the building?
already beyond the building.
Oh, really?
That's what I'm telling you. When it's right there, it's already beyond the building. Because I'm like standing here, this is the building right across from our hotel, the door I came out. I turn, get my camera on the thing, and it's already gone up the street and is outside of that building, and then it goes around the building.
So did you feel like, as it was happening, that this would be similar to some of the reports that have come through about the creature?
Yeah, for sure.
So is this event, to your mind, proof that some of the reports are maybe misidentified in some way?
Yes. 8 seconds, 8-9 seconds is what we're looking at in terms of like from when I first see it, shoot it, to when it flies off. It's a very abbreviated sighting, and in that moment, it was a massive man-sized bird flying over my head.
Okay, in all honesty, I think this is really valuable for several reasons. One, it was something that was absurd and bizarre and weird, and it felt like aligned with what you were doing in the city. It was like very similar to what drew you there, what brought you there. But ultimately, like in the moment, you were like, holy cow, this is like something as big as a man.
Yeah.
And whether or not you ultimately believed that it was Mothman, you I feel like for a moment, you entertained the idea. You had like a little Rolodex of, does it fit these categories? Is it similar to this creature in these ways?
There's also a really dismissive attitude regarding most of the early reports, especially the ones directly out of Chicago. And the thinking being that they're all hoaxes. The reason for that is that there's no video evidence to back them up, despite the fact that they're in a very populated area, traffic cameras and all that kind of stuff. There's the idea that they haven't been able to actually find the witnesses or corroborate their stories. Do you have a response to that?
No, of course. Now, well, you missed one of them, which is why do all of the reports only come through Phantoms and Monsters, UFO Clearinghouse, and the Singular Fortean Society? For anybody who's marketing savvy at all, it's called search engine optimization. Most of these people, when they are going to report their sighting, or really before they even get to that stage and they just saw something weird and they want to try to figure out what it was, they go to Google and they type in something like winged monster Chicago or something along those lines. And because of SEO, you're going to get Phantoms and Monsters or us or UFO Clearinghouse or something similar. And so most of the people end up going through us because we're who they find first. The idea that that's odd, again, never really made sense to me, because where else would they go? Like, nobody calls the police anymore. I mean, people figured that out decades ago, that it's pointless to call the police about something like this.
Definitively state what the biggest issues you have are with the reports that are out there.
The biggest issue?
Yeah,
is there's
the biggest red flags, I guess.
The biggest red flags? Yeah. At least the ones that we've read are obviously contrived of some sort, for some purpose. I don't know why, but what annoys us is that we are being accused of being critical of these, when in fact we are surprised that other people aren't being critical.
I feel like the biggest issue with all these reports, with a lot of these reports, is that we don't know who the witnesses are. By the end of 2017, there was something like 59 sightings, 59 reports, but we don't have any information on these witnesses. Now, witness confidentiality is very important, but when you have 59 sightings by the end of 1 year, such information needs to be shared with other researchers at least. You don't want to put any confidential information about your witness out to the public. That's understandable. But you want to collaborate with others.
So the big skeptical argument against the Lake Michigan stuff, the argument that's coming back is that these 2017 to present day sightings are pretty much manufactured by you and Manuel. And there's maybe even an indication that Tobias is manufacturing them as well. And so what I want to know is, like, what is your response to the idea that everything is sort of made up wholesale?
Well, people can believe what they want. And quite frankly, the argument has come back to me that they want us to release information about the actual witnesses. And I'm not going to do that. I just will refuse to do that unless the witness says it's okay. And there have been a few instances where they have said it's okay. MUFON was upset that we followed up on the cases. And a lot of these reports that we had gotten later, especially early ones at O'Hare, were originally sent to MUFON, and they just discounted it. So these people would find out that either I or Manuel were doing the investigations, and they would contact us. So I don't let that type of stuff bother me anymore. I used to years and years ago. I don't have time for that. I don't have time to manufacture stuff. You know how much I'm doing. I don't have time to make up these stories.
Because what we're talking about here is that, is there one person hoaxing? Are there multiple persons hoaxing? What is the ultimate goal?
We thought there was an op of some sort. People think, you're conspiratorial. No, an op is basically an operation where say we have 2 or 3 people together that are trying to perform some sort of guerrilla marketing. I asked Lon, I says, was Seth knowing to do any guerrilla marketing during that period of time? See? Of course you did. And well, guess where it originated. The bottom line was, I asked him, because that's, I mean, it's like, I think it's brilliant. We got the 50th year anniversary, and so I says, well, this is guerrilla marketing. This is what it looks like to me. So we were looking at things from some sort of operation. And that's one thing to do. So it wasn't that far-fetched.
So we've been here now for a few days. We've talked to investigators, we've talked to witnesses, we've talked to folklorists even. What is your take on the Lake Michigan Mothman, especially opposed to what you know about Point Pleasant, because you have done a lot on that?
I think the Lake Michigan Mothman is an appropriate title as opposed to the Chicago Mothman, because it's a much bigger phenomenon than what just calling it the Chicago Mothman indicates. There were these initial reports that took place in Chicago proper,
right,
which have since spread out into the suburbs surrounding Chicago and then into other states like Indiana and Michigan. I find a lot of the downtown Chicago reports very questionable.
Yeah.
But the reports that Tobias is taking in seem to be believable, and having met witnesses who actually contacted him, we can corroborate those people actually claim these events happened to them. Having met Bob out here in Indiana, we know that Bob is a real person. This actually happened to him. He encountered something unknown. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, my current opinion is that there is something to the Lake Michigan Mothman. I think this case is the perfect example of how convoluted and confusing the paranormal and investigating the paranormal actually is. Because people are looking for a neat way of wrapping this case up. So you've got people who simply want to debunk everything that's coming in.
Yeah.
And you have people that want to accept everything that's coming in.
Mm-hmm.
The people that kind of want to theorize about what's going on are saying it's the Mothman or something like the Mothman, only with cryptid. People that want to write it off have nailed it down to hoaxes and misidentifications.
Yeah.
And maybe this like gray area where there might be something kind of unknown actually happening.
Yeah.
And the truth is, I think it's a little bit of all of that.
Right, right. And I think one thing that we talked about with Ellie that was really important is because of what you experienced just last night, that you kind of got to see, even though you're not taking reports, you got to see what it would be like to be a potential witness, like how quickly it happened and how unclear it would be even if you had a camera ready to go because you're filming a documentary, right?
What do you think?
I think that there's something happening that people are seeing. I'm not saying, obviously there are hoaxes, but that comes along with everything, really. I don't see how that would be different for any cryptid or paranormal thing. There are always going to be people messing around, but the people that we have spoken to, something happened, and I believe them. I got no sense of them lying, you know? And I don't know what they gained from it to even say these stories. So they're seeing something. I don't know what it is because I haven't experienced it. So for me, it is a really cool story. Not a fake story, but just something I can take their word for.
Folklore is defined as artistic communication in small groups, which sounds like something very heavy-handed or high-minded, but ultimately what it means is that when you tell a story, you are performing something. and you are doing so with an artful intent. You're mindful of other successful forms of the same story that you have witnessed, that you have been told, that you've seen in the media. And because you've recognized those as successful versions of that same style of story, you implement it when you tell your own story. So you are performing for an audience, and you're giving your audience a chance to debate, to think about their own perspectives, their own lives. So you're performing in a small group. So things like this, where you are sharing your story with a small group of people, even if it's online, you're still participating in folklore.
Will it last?
Definitely. Oh, Mothman is gonna persist past all of us. Are you kidding me? So we have these sightings in the 1960s, and there's also been some people who've done like forensic historical assigning of Mothman to previous dates before the 1960 flap. But then you also, again, you have sightings, extreme amount of sightings in the aughts and in the 2010s. There are people who have assigned Mothman to being present during the 9/11 Twin Towers bombings. There's been people who said they saw Mothman before the first H1N1 outbreak in Mexico. And then there are people who have said they've seen Mothman at Chernobyl. Very famously kind of deconstructed as a fabrication for the Mothman Prophecies film. But that goes back to my point. Even if that narrative was constructed for a film, if people tell it as true and it is believed by a large audience of people, ultimately, doesn't that make it true to an extent? Because these stories that all of us tell and that all of us hear and that all of us experience could easily be as true or untrue as anything around us, but we still behave our lives as though they're true. So would those not be true too?
To date, 2017 has been the year with the most sightings reported to investigators. Regardless, witnesses still come forward at a regular pace. Such events don't seem to be tapering off anytime soon. Even the pandemic failed to hinder the appearance of a winged humanoid in the area of Lake Michigan. However, there is a slight evolution in the current trend. The epicenter of sightings has shifted, with the most recent reports moving away from Chicago proper, the suburbs, and the lake shore, and into the immediate area of the Chicago O'Hare International Airport.
Witnesses continue to contact investigators through MUFON, UFO Clearinghouse, Phantoms and Monsters, and the Singular Fortean Society. Most of the initial investigators are still active in the ever-changing case, still seeking answers as to the what and the why behind these sightings that have been labeled the Lake Michigan Mothman.
Do you guys think we'll ever actually know the truth behind what is going on here, specifically with the Mothman case?
That's a great question.
That is a great question. I mean, it's sort of the question, isn't it? I think personally, it's possible. I think that we're sort of gaining ground in a lot of ways in some more mainstream sciences to sort of allow us to begin to answer those kinds of questions. I think that more people are taking this seriously. And so when we start to consider sort of like the interplay of consciousness and these phenomena, for instance, I think that we're beginning to be able to open those doors and sort of see what's on the other side, and maybe it's Mothman. So I'll give it a maybe.
Emily, all the time and energy and money expended on investigating this, why do it, and is it worth it?
I mean, we've got so many unanswered questions in this life, and just the idea that there could be other dimensions and just these weird unexplained things, it's just exciting, and absolutely it's worth it, because if there aren't people like us looking to find these things, then who will, you know?